Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody from wherever you are. My name is Claudia Baez Camargo, and I'm the Director of Prevention, Research and Innovation at the Basel Institute on Governance. And I'm really pleased to be moderating this webinar today. The title is Detect, Develop, Defend, How to Build Effective Corruption Risks Indicators and Red Flag Systems. It is a really a topic that we are passionate about because we are coming from the research side of things, and it's proof of concept on how the research actually needs to move in order to become actionable and an actual resource for the people who are implementing and making decisions in the anti-corruption space. So we have three great presentations today in stock. Just before going to that, just to say that we are recording the session, and we're very, very happy to have your questions. So please, as we go along, we'll have a Q&A at the end after the presentations. But in the meantime, please feel free to start putting in your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar. And please, if you can keep your microphones muted, that will make the experience all the best for all of us. So again, we have three presenters today, three really experienced and strong researchers with whom we have been working in the FALCON project, which is what's bringing us together today. So the first speaker is Daniel Kofran. He is a quantitative expert at the Governance Transparency Institute, who has studied applied economics and economic analysis at the Corvinus University of Budapest, and works on projects dealing with causal data analysis based on observational data sets, and has done a lot of work around quantifying indicators and measuring causal inference in the field of good governance. We also have Giorgia Cascone with us. She is an economist and an international organization expert. She works at Transcrime, and she has done a lot of work with other academic institutions, and she's one of the lead researchers on the side of Transcrime for the FALCON project. And then we have Dr. Jacopo Costa, who is one of the team members here at the Basel Institute on Governance, has been working with us for the past 6 years, has a PhD in sociology and political studies, and his research focuses on a variety of topics, including the nature of informal networks, researching and mapping complex grant corruption case studies, and looking at the nexus between corruption and money laundering. So we will hear from them in turn, but maybe before that, I want to give a little bit of background of this FALCON project, which is what is bringing us together today. So I will share my screen. So this is the Fighting Corruption and Organized Crime project known as FALCON. It is a EU Horizon funded project. Here are the details about it. It brings 26 partners from all around Europe, as you can see. And it's a really interesting and exciting consortium in the sense that it's bringing together different stakeholder groups that make the project special in the kind of ambition that it's expected to reach. And let me explain what I mean with this. We have partners who are social science and humanities researchers. That includes all of us today presenting in the webinar, looking at how corruption happens, what are the modus operandi, what are the patterns in which corruption is taking place. And then we have the next set of stakeholders in our consortium are tech partners, so technological partners who are the ones that have the engagement with the technology, with the AI, because the aim of the project is to translate the findings from the research into actionable AI-powered tools that will help law enforcement better detect, investigate, and punish corruption. So the third stakeholder group that is participating in the consortium is actually the so-called end users. And this is what we mean by this are the law enforcement agencies and security domain experts. As you can see, we have a good number of law enforcement agencies involved in the project. So it's really a case study of how research can be translated into actionable tools using AI for the benefit of law enforcement in support of the fight against corruption. So we have several objectives in the project. I will not go in depth into all of them for the sake of time, but basically it is analyzing what is happening in the corruption landscape, figuring out what is the data that we need to acquire in order to come up with these tools, these analytical tools that include risk assessments, include investigative tools, include detection and red flags systems. And ultimately, the end is to have impact at the policy level. FALCON focuses on 4 specific kinds of corruption or corruption-related typologies. So one is public procurement fraud. And as most of you in this audience, I'm sure are pretty aware of, public procurement is probably the one area where most public resources are lost to corruption. The second use case is sanctions circumvention by kleptocrats and oligarchs, which is, needless to say, really timely and relevant topic at the moment. Use case 3 is about corruption schemes at the border crossings with increased global flows of resources and goods. Corruption at the border becomes incredibly sensitive. And use case 4 refers to conflict of interest of politically exposed persons. So today we will be addressing 3 of these use cases, namely public procurement, sanctions circumvention, and border corruption. And we will learn how the researchers have translated their findings from the research into actionable indicators that form the basis for constructing red flag systems. Just to bring attention to the fact that the FALCON project has published 2 policy briefs already. So one is synthesizing the findings of the research in terms of high-level corruption, how it happens, what are its costs, and what are policy recommendations. And the second one is on leveraging artificial intelligence in the fight against corruption. So I will put the links to these resources in the chat in a little bit, and you're all very welcome to have a look and download them. For any further information on the FALCON project, the project coordinator is Dr. Jenny Adamapoulou from ICCS, Institute of Communications and Computer Systems in Greece. And in our home, in the Basel Institute, Jacopo is our principal investigator for FALCON. We have a Twitter link and LinkedIn account, so it's easy to follow us. Let me stop sharing my screen. And with that, I'm very happy to give the floor to Daniel, who will tell us about developing the indicators for public procurement corruption. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Claudia, for the brief introduction. So, let me share my screen in a moment. I hope now you see my presentation. My name is Daniel Kofran. I work as a quantitative analyst at the Government Transparency Institute, and today I'm going to talk about how to design and validate corruption risk indicators or red flags using quantitative empirical evidence. All right, so the short outline for today's presentation is the following. There will be 2 main sections I'm going to discuss. First, the main features and building blocks of quantitative indicators, and second, the indicators especially used for FALCON through some examples and I will just touch very shortly the conflict of interest indicator, because as Claudia mentioned, this is not in the main scope of today's presentation, but we have some interesting results there nevertheless. And the third will be just a very quick example use case, which is also based on deliverable 2.3, which is the cost of corruption calculation. Everything else will be either deliverable 2.2 or 2.3 for the FALCON project. All right. So first, before going into the details of indicator building, let's discuss some of the main features, including the goals of indicator creation. So for most of us, it's very evident that measuring corruption risk is usually not directly observable. Corruption is a very complex and sometimes hidden phenomena, so we want to implement some efficient ways of measuring corruption, which is reliable over time. Second, we want to identify and isolate potentially corrupt contracts. And third, we want to build actionable tools that can automatically highlight corruption risks with the help of corruption risk index, which I will talk about at a later stage. We can now measure some very reliable measures of corruption risk through public administrative data. All right. So before moving on, let's discuss the basic differences between qualitative and quantitative indicators. Because for a long time, corruption indicators were dominantly based on qualitative or non-administrative data. For example, surveys of perceptions, reviews of institutional frameworks, or detailed case audits. While all of these techniques have an important role in corruption detection, they also share some great limitations. For example, the biases of perception, the indirect measurement of corruption, or the inherently narrower scope of case audits. To supplement these very important findings, in the last 10 years or so, quantitative indicators began to be developed through relying on administrative data that document directly observable decisions made throughout the tendering process, which describes the actual behavior of participants. And that's the main advantages of using these quantitative indicators, that we can measure corruption more directly through critical decision points that we are going to talk about in a minute. But before going to the building blocks, the last main thing we need to discuss is the key features of these quantitative corruption risk indicators. They have to be objective, de facto, micro level, internationally comparable, comprehensive, and time series. What I mean by this, that objective means that they are based on factual data and not perception of the facts. De facto means that they should indicate the actual behavior through these administrative or procedural decisions, and not the de jure frameworks of anti-corruption or tendering, which the tenders have been placed in. All right, so micro level is that they should be defined on the level of actors of corrupt exchanges, for example, as buyers or suppliers, or the transactions themselves among them, for example, contracts. An important note that they can be aggregated at higher levels, but if we can develop indicators that can be calculated at the contract level, it makes them that much more comparable over time or any other dimension. And that's what the latter three key features are all about: comparability. Comparability between countries or regions, between different organizations, and between different points in time, for example, years. All right, so the four main steps that we are going to discuss in detail are the following. First, we need a clear definition of corruption or conflict of interest or fraud or whichever subcategory of corruption we want to measure. Then we need a dictionary of corruption technologies, schemes, or techniques that can be used to exploit this definition of corruption for your personal gains. What's important here is that we want to track the administrative traces of these corrupt schemes. So we need a model that can connect these corruption technologies, for example, chopping up a bigger procedure into small procedures which are under the threshold of mandatory publication. And here in the modeling, we can connect every of these corruption technologies to reliable data points. And the fourth one is the most complex one, which is the indicator validation through statistical and econometric means. I'm going to discuss this in the most detail, so that's what I'm going to tell you about them for now. So let's jump into the steps step by step. First, the working definition that we use for the FALCON project is the following. The aim of corruption is to steer a contract to favored bidder without detection. So this is the public procurement framework and corruption definition that we use, which can be done in a number of ways, including avoiding or restricting competition and favoring a certain bidder by tailoring specifications or any other means of information sharing, for example. Second, now we have a corruption definition. We can connect this to corrupt schemes or techniques. One example I already shared, but here, for the sake of brevity and for its presentation, I brought to you the most critical decision points in the public procurement process where these techniques may occur. Okay, so this is the public procurement lifecycle. I'm sure everybody or a lot of you are familiar with this, but this starts from the planning and advertisement phase, goes through the selection and submission, and the evaluation phases, and ends at the contract management stage. Here, under these phases are the critical decision points, which can be connected to some schemes. And in the next slide, we can see that the first three phases are the phases where we have usually reliable administrative data, which can help us in the modeling section in the next slide. Before jumping on, let's just talk about contract management for a moment, because as you can see, contract negotiation and contract execution are less administered steps. For example, contract negotiation requires a lot of informational exchange, which are not administered usually. And contract execution focuses on the quality, which is also not something that is quantitatively administered at most of the contracts end. But a contract scheme, for example, that I wanted to mention here is choosing your procedure type. Choosing another procedure type and not open may help you achieve your corruption definition, may help you to restrict competition. For example, using negotiated procedures increases the chances of you sharing asymmetric information in the contract negotiation phase, which is less documented, but with the help of procedure type that we can observe, we can trace it back to this planning advertisement phase risk. So now that we have some ideas on what's the corruption that we use, the corruption definition, and what are some techniques, let's discuss the model. The model is fairly straightforward. We have four main dimensions, which are the buyer or the contracting body, the supplier or the bidder, the contract between them, and the fourth dimension is the particularistic type that might be used to exploit the corruption techniques that we discussed earlier. So today, for most part of the presentation, we're going to talk about the former three sections. These are about the buyers, the bidders, and the contract. We will discuss these as these have the most reliable administrative data connected to them, because particularistic ties is a bit more hidden than any of the other main dimensions. So we'll discuss them in very little detail at the end of the next main section. So finally, we arrive at indicator validation through statistical testing. Here, I will show you some of the specifics, but that's for the connoisseurs of econometrics. For starters, I think what's more important is for us to have a common understanding of the logic behind the statistical testing. For the logic, there are three main actors that we need to be aware of. First, we need a tangible indicator of corrupt intent, which is something that's known to be strongly associated with corruption. And then second, we need a new indicator that we want to validate, and we need to measure the relationship between this new indicator and the corruption proxy that we chose at the first step. And the third part is that these associations should remain strong enough after controlling for other important factors, such as the market specifics or even the countries that they are tendered in. All right, so a bit more detail. The most commonly used corruption proxy is single bidding. This is, as in the literature, it has the most widespread appreciation as corruption proxy, and it is the archetypical outcome of corrupt tendering process. It's very well in line with our definition, which is that avoiding or restricting competition, or this is one of the most common ways that you can achieve that, and we use it for all of our validation processes in the FALCON project. The second step can be amended with the following, that we use econometric tools such as regressions to measure the relationship of this potential indicator to the known evidence of corruption. And third, we need to control for confounding factors that may distort the effect. So we want to measure the most unbiased effect that we can, and simply comparing two groups next to each other wouldn't suffice. So we include a lot of control variables, for example, the market, the country or region, the type of the buyer, the year of the tender, and some of these most commonly used confounding factors, so we can measure the most unbiased effect that we can between these two indicators, the indicator that we're trying to validate and single bidding. A very straightforward example is following the example of procedure types. So in this indicator testing, we want to answer questions like the following. Do contracts awarded through negotiated procedures have a significantly higher share of single bidding compared to open procedures or not? On the figure, we can see the share of single bidding among negotiated contracts and among open contracts, or contracts with these procedure types administered to them. And we can see that negotiated have a higher percentage of single bidding as opposed to open procedure. What we are trying to measure is that while this apparent magnitude is higher, we want to measure whether it is statistically significant or not. So to achieve this, we use econometric models, and we also include control variables to answer even deeper questions, such as even after accounting for market, geography, and time, does this significant increase applies or not? All right. So this is the most interesting slide to me on this whole presentation. These are the specifics. I'm not going to bore most of you, but if you have any questions, this is a slide which we can come back to and discuss some of the more technical details of indicator validation. The most important things about the whole process that I'm going to talk about are the following. We use logistic regressions because single bidding is a binary outcome. It's either have one bid or more bids observed, and then we can calculate single bidding by that. And the second is that if the connection, the partial correlation is very high, we can distort between high risk and low risk contracts, and we can differentiate between high, medium, and low risk contracts when there is a gap between those contracts that or those categories that are deemed to have a significantly higher correlation to single bidding. All right, so this is an example output. It's actually from FALCON deliverable 2.2, which may help us understand the final steps of this validation and how we deem an indicator valid or not. Here in the first two rows, we can see the procedure medium and high risk contract groups, and we can see that the association or the partial correlation between procedure type and single bidding is significant and positive, which marks it as a valid indicator. However, if these effects are not there, then it wouldn't count as a valid indicator for the purposes of building tools for that specific country, for example, that may use all of these corruption risk indicators that we validate throughout this process. So with this in mind, let's jump to the final list of indicators used for the FALCON project. First, there is a clear distinction between different groups of indicators. As we discussed in the third step in the model, there is a bunch of indicators that are connected to the contract. So these are the tendering risk indicators, and the other categories are connected to either the buyer or the supplier or both. And what we can see here is that they have relatively equal distribution between the tendering and the buyer and the supplier-based risks. And to assess, we use the following indicators for the whole FALCON project. We use whether a contract has a single bid submitted or more, whether a call for tender have been published in an official journal or not, what's the procedure type that we can observe, and what's the length of the submission period, and what's the length of the decision period. On the buyer and supplier-based risk side, we can see that some of these are connected to both or either of one. The winner's contract share is the buyer's concentration of the total amount of contracts spent in a year. So if a buyer spends all of its income or all of its budget on one supplier in a year, then it will be associated with higher risks as opposed if it has a lot of suppliers with a small share evenly distributed. The next indicator is tax haven, which means whether the supplier is administered to a tax haven country or not. The eighth one is local supplier, whether the buyer and the supplier share the exact same location. It could be by postcodes, it could be by regions. And the last two are connected in its logic and calculated slightly different ways. The first is the number of distinct markets or two-digit CPV codes a supplier is present on, and the unusual market entry flags it by an additional dimension by time, whether in a year the same supplier has a new market registered under it. For example, a company working in construction has suddenly won a contract in medical equipment. So these are the indicators. I'm going to talk about three main examples, as another categorization of these indicators is by whether they are a binary variable, a category variable, or a numeric variable. So let's see the binary indicator example used for the FALCON project. Here, the definition is that an indicator is binary if they have only two distinct categories, where one indicates the presence of the indicator at high risk, zero indicates the absence of an indicator, and low risk. A very clear example is no call for tender. It equals 1 if we cannot observe a call for tender published, and it equals 0 if we see the call for tender published. The basic instinct here is there is always a category which is described as less risky or not risky, and one which is described as higher risk or very high risk. And what we can see here is that we compare these two categories, whether they have a significantly higher association with corruption as opposed to the group with the low risks associated with it. So that's the same logic that applies to category indicators, but the main difference is that category indicators are variables which has more than two distinct categories. The example that I'm going to talk about here is procedure type, as we've already started to get to know this example. So here, the main difference is that we don't have two categories, so we need to select one category, which is the reference category, and which is the least associated with corruption. For example, open procedure type and procedure types. And here, we check every other procedure type to open procedure and see whether they have a larger associated corruption risk, or in this case, a higher partial correlation to single bidding. That's just a technical term, partial correlation. The main takeaway here is whether a contract with a negotiated without publication as its procedure type has a higher chance of being a corrupt tender as compared to open procedure types. And for Bulgaria, we can see that there are some categories which can be described as high risk, and there are some which can be described as medium risk. But we can say that all of these categories that are not the open category have a higher association with corruption than the open one, measured by single bidding. And the other example which is useful here is Croatia, where we can see that there might be categories that don't have a significantly higher association with single bidding than open procedure types. And we can see for Croatia there are a total of 5 different low-risk categories in its total pool of 8. All right. So next, the numeric indicators, or the third main category here, which we'll talk about through the example of buyer spending concentration. I already introduced this as the supplier's share of the total annual value of contracts awarded by a buyer. So this is a continuous number between 0 and 1, or sometimes 0 and 100% share. And we can see that values close to this 100% share indicate high corruption risk, while values close to 0 share indicate a low corruption risk. To recap, this means 100% would mean that the supplier only awarded contracts, a buyer only awarded contracts to a single supplier in the whole year. And if we go back to the corruption definition, which means tailoring specifications so that a specific supplier wins. This is very close to that definition. And this is what this indicator measures. And we can see it in some graphs. On the leftmost side, we can see the histogram of buyer spending concentration with buyers with at least 5 contracts for Serbia. And we can see that most of these buyer supplier year observations are among the lowest end of the spectrum. So a lot of suppliers have a low share of total spending in a buyer's cycle. However, at the very rightmost end, we can see a slight increase, which shows us that there are some suppliers which have the 100% of the total annual spending of a buyer. And that's what we want to capture through this indicator. And the graph on the right can show us the correlation between buyer concentration on this buyer supplier year level and the share of single bidding aggregated to the same level. And we can see that there's a positive significant correlation. All right, so the final step, which helps us to create tools that can make actionable tools that we can use to isolate and work on only a subset of contracts that are more likely to be corrupt, is the Corruption Risk Index, or CRI. This is the average of all the available and validated indicators for a given country. This means available means that there is administrative data available, and validated means that it had this higher association with corruption at the first place. All right, and the main advantage of using this as opposed to only one single indicator, that it's more robust. So if many or all indicators indicate high corruption risks, only then will CRI will be high, and that it will indicate that this contract is a high risk contract overall. So high CRI values close to 1 means that through a lot of dimensions, catching a lot of different schemes or types of corruption techniques, and which means that high CRI contracts are the one that we want to investigate if we could only investigate a very limited number of contracts, for example. As we can see here, distribution can also tell us some important aspects that may be the basis of future evaluation. This is now the example of Italy for the FALCON project, where we can see that the distribution of this aggregated index, the CRI, is fairly normal for buyers. And of course, for individual contracts is also fairly normal, but some of these numbers will concentrate around some numbers, for example, 0.5 or 0.75. And what's interesting here and can be basis for future evaluation is the distribution of suppliers, which is not a normal distribution, which is more like a bimodal distribution having 2 modes. So the first mode around 0.33 and the second mode around 0.5, which means there's a subset of contracts that have an unusually higher average CRI, and maybe if we could investigate these, we would find suppliers that are in the second group and are making some corrupt exchanges. And finally, and we'll just touch this very briefly, are the particularistic tie-based indicators, the political connection-based indicators, which we have used the conflict of interest in the FALCON project. Because of data limitations, only Bulgaria and Croatia were examined, and we could see here that we need, of course, a new working definition of this subset of corruption, which is that the company is considered to have a conflict of interest if a politically exposed person is in the ownership of the supplier. Here, we only compared these PEP-linked companies to non-PEP-linked companies and assessed whether they are more likely to win higher risk contracts measured by this CRI. The very important known limitations is the limited data availability on local politicians, the asset and interest declarations of decision-making bureaucrats, and of course the indirect ownership and payments, which are very common, and companies may be registered under relatives, proxies, or other instruments. And the results that I'm going to show you is quite surprising, because despite the substantial data limitations, PEP-related suppliers are significantly more likely to be awarded higher CRI contracts. We can see, for example, the elected Bulgarian legislatives if they are in a supplier's ownership, then the CRI's change is 28.31% higher as opposed to suppliers without PEP-linked persons in their ownership. The final slide that I'm going to show you, the final slide is the use case used for deliverable 2.3, the cost of corruption calculation. This is a very powerful and very short presentation of what the effects of using these tools may be. Here, we followed 4 simple steps. We validated individual indicators, as I mentioned. We calculated the CRI, which is the aggregation of all of these individual indicators that are available and valid. And then we modeled the relationship between CRI and prices using estimated prices and final prices. And then we just grouped the contracts into high, medium, and low CRI groups. And we can see on this graph that while low risk contracts have a very small ratio of estimated extra spending due to corruption risk and total spending, increasing the risk and going to medium risk contracts and high risk contracts, we can see a larger and larger share of this estimated extra spending due to corruption risks as opposed to the total spending. So that's my part of the presentation. I will now stop sharing and I will give up the floor for our next presenter.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was fantastic, and I think it really goes, to demonstrate how this kind of research and development of indicators and red flags can deliver with a degree of granularity that is really to the point, showing us that what is high risk in one context is not necessarily high risk in another context. So really giving us the context-specific detail. And as more and more countries embrace e-procurement systems, the promise of, because of course the volume of data is enormous, right? So the prospect of being able to deploy AI-powered algorithms that make use of these kind of indicators to detect patterns over a large number of data, I think is one of the more promising avenues in anti-corruption detection going forward. But now I want to give the floor to Giorgia, who's going to tell us about developing indicators for sanctions circumvention. So Giorgia, the floor is yours. And we will have questions at the end. Lumponias. So we'll come back to you, and feel free to write in the chat your question. Anyway,
okay,
over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Giorgia. Now I will try to share my presentation. Okay, so now you should be able to see my presentation. Is it right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Giorgia, and today I will be focusing on sanctions circumvention, and in particular on how from in-depth research activities we were able to provide and construct actionable risk indicators that are able to prevent and detect possible sanction evasion schemes and behaviors. Just to give you a brief context of our work, sanctions are used as an intervention tool that are used to prevent and respond to current or emerging crises. And however, their effectiveness is prevented and is limited because of these existing sanctions evasion tactics that usually exploit legal loopholes or also regulatory gaps. And in particular, the enforcement of restrictive measures has gained significant attention following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this because the imposition of sanctions have given rise to several evading dynamics. And this is a very important issue because in particular, European economic operators are facing significant challenges because they have to ensure that their operations don't involuntarily support sanctioned entities. So, in general, it is very important there is the very important need for this kind of studies that are able to provide a clear understanding of the scale, the nature, and in particular the methods, the actual methods that are employed in such evasion, sanction evasion activities. And these studies are also able and are also needed to provide and construct more operationalizable risk indicators, so that enforcers and investigators can use actionable instruments to better and more readily detect and also prevent such activities. So here comes our work. And here in the slide, you can see how the process of constructing risk indicators is designed. In particular, in general terms, we start from this in-depth research that is aimed at identifying anomalous factors, in particular risk factors, relevant risk factors. And these studies can have very different nature. So they can come from scientific studies, they can come from existing regulations and guidelines, or from the analysis of case studies, and also through the from the integration of inputs from experts. And once that this evidence, this information have been gathered and risk factors have been identified, these key information are translated into more operationalizable risk indicators that are more easily usable, for example, by tools, just to give an example. And then forward through this process, these risk indicators are also tested and validated through further research and also through the available engineering. Now, in this presentation, I will specifically focus on a study, on an analysis that we conducted on case studies, and how from the evidence gathered through this analysis, we retrieved key risk indicators. And I will show you also an example on a real case study and how these risk indicators can be very useful in, let's say, signaling potential sanction evasion activities. So, this study. As I already anticipated, this study had the aim to examining the schemes that are aimed at circumventing sanctions. And in particular, for this analysis, for this study, we adopted two main approaches. The first one was represented by a systematic collection and analysis of open source information. And this open source information were gathered from news articles, reports, and other publicly available materials. And from a, let's say, wider sample of case studies, we selected a subset of 97 case studies, and this to give some sort of geographical balance. And here the analysis was focused on identifying the key forms, the most common forms of sanctions violations, the key jurisdictions involved, and the modus operandi adopted in these schemes. Then a second approach was represented by an intelligence-based analysis of corporate networks. And this was based on a very comprehensive corporate data set, which is the Moody's Bureau van Dijk. I don't know if I always find it right, but and this corporate data set includes very important details on ownership and financial structures. And these data were matched to sanctioned individuals that are included in the most common sanction lists. And here, instead, the focus of the analysis was to compare the companies with connections to sanctioned entities before and after the sanctions were imposed. So, moving to the key results from this kind of analysis. From the analysis of case studies, firstly, we identified two most common forms of sanctions violations. The violation of sectoral sanctions, where sectoral sanctions are, let's say, prohibitions of specific activities within specific sectors. And here, the most common violation was represented by the trade of prohibited goods or services. And secondly, even if less common was the violation of targeted sanctions, which are instead directed to designated individuals or entities and are aimed at limiting their access to their wealth or assets. And here, indeed, the most common type of violation was found to be the evasion of the freeze of assets through the concealment of the beneficial ownership or the transfer of assets. And these are, let's say, I will show you more into detail in the next slide, focusing on the modi operandi. So, as I anticipated, moving to the modi operandi, we identified several important risk factors. In particular, from one side, we identified important temporal and geographical dimension of sanction evasion schemes. Indeed, from one side, we found that the violations often occurred shortly after the sanctions were imposed. And so this suggested temporal proximity as a relevant risk factor for signaling such behaviors. And at the same time, also the geographical proximity emerged as very relevant, because we found that the Northeast Europe acted as a hotspot, as a key hotspot for the main actions of sanctions evasion. Other very relevant risk factors that emerged were represented by the business connections with sanctioned markets. Indeed, for example, the North Atlantic countries were significantly involved in sectoral sanctions, and also the involvement of high-risk jurisdictions. So just to give you an example, in targeted sanctions, Switzerland, Jersey, the British Virgin Islands were often involved as satellite countries, so used to facilitate this scheme. And also, instead, in sectoral sanctions, there was often the involvement of Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and these in order to facilitate and conceal the triangulation of the prohibited goods. So here, let's say, what emerged in more, let's say, operative terms, the modi operandi of sanctions evasion schemes. And in terms also of the roles that were identified as relevant, the corporate entities emerge as very crucial in facilitating these activities. Indeed, they were often used to obscure the financial transactions or conceal the true beneficial owners or redirecting the goods. And the most common types of corporate entities that emerged were the operational companies, shell and front companies for sure, and also legal arrangements such as trusts. Also the intermediaries, so facilitators, had a very important role in intermediate such schemes, and the most common figures that emerged were family members and friends, business partners, and professionals. And finally, the most common financial channels instead used for moving funds were bank transactions, offshore accounts, and also we saw a rising role of the payments through cryptocurrencies. Finally, from the analysis on the intelligence-based corporate networks, which I remind was focused on comparing the ownership structures before and after the sanctions were imposed after the invasion of Ukraine. And this because we wanted to identify those relevant changes that could be able to signal potential attempts to evade sanctions. And here what emerged were, first of all, the most common typologies of ownership structuring, in particular the simple replacement. So basically where the shares that were owned by the sanctioned individuals are transferred to other individuals, and these typically are business partners or relatives. Then there is the disappearance and structural changes. So the sanctioned individual is totally removed from the ownership chain. And finally, there could be the dilution of the ownership. So the shares were diluted, and this to conceal the real control held by the sanctioned individual. And finally, also from this kind of analysis, the direct connections with sanctioned entities, and the crucial role of international satellite intermediaries emerge as a very, very important risk factors for signaling such behaviors. So just to wrap up, here we are at a point where from the analysis of case studies integrated through the intelligence-based analysis of corporate networks, we identified, let's say, the most common patterns of behaviors. Here we identified the key risk factors. And finally, here we operationalized and we translated these risk factors into 18 primary risk indicators. These risk indicators were grouped into 4 main categories. So those focused on customers, those on consumers, so more, let's say, focused on the clear end users, those focused on transactions, and those focus on the destinations. And it's also noticeable to say that those primary indicators were further detailed into several micro indicators in order to better give specificities and give better and more detailed guidelines to the operators. Here you can see how the information, the key evidence that I mentioned you before have been translated and are reflected into those risk indicators. So, for example, under the customers-based indicators, you can find the relevant connections to sanctioned entities as emerging as relevant, or also the changes in the ownership shortly after the sanctions were imposed. You should remember the temporal proximity emerging as a very relevant risk factor. And this is valid also for the other risk indicators. So the involvement of prohibited goods or the payments via cryptocurrencies, the involvement of offshore accounts in high-risk jurisdictions, and so on. So it's very, very clear now how this information where this information come from. And now I would like to show you how these risk indicators can be very helpful in investigative activities, because it's important to remember to remind that these risk indicators for sure don't substitute the, let's say, human factors or the human interpretation of the cases, but they should be used as, let's say, a training tools for the eye of the investigators, of the operators, and so that it is easier to detect and readily respond to such behaviors. So, for example, in this real case that I anonymized, there was this Russian businessman who acquired multiple real estate properties in the US, and this through 2 shell companies that were registered in Panama and the Bahamas. And these shell companies were indirectly owned by this businessman via other shell companies that were registered in Panama and in the British Virgin Islands. And in order to manage these properties, he also involved an attorney, and this attorney handled the payments via a trust. So already in this first piece of text, we can see some very key information emerging. So, for example, the involvement of high-risk jurisdictions like Panama, Bahamas, British Virgin Islands, or the involvement of shell companies. There are many shell companies involved, and also the layer given by the, let's say, indirect ownership through these shell companies. So we can see already a very complex corporate structure, ownership structure. Also, there is the involvement of a professional and of trust. So many key elements that I already mentioned being potentially signaling evading behaviors. And indeed, following the actual sanctions were imposed, the businessman changed his behavior, his payment methods, and indeed it started routing his funds through a bank account registered in the Bahamas, and this bank account was linked to a shell company which was owned by a friend, and also through a bank account instead registered in Russia, which was instead held by a family member. So also here, right after the sanctions were imposed, so other important risk indicator, the oligarch started employing further shell companies, involving further high-risk jurisdictions, and also further intermediaries, so the close associate and the family member. So this to tell you that in this real case that we simplified in this picture in a more schematic way, it is clear how 5 key risk indicators were emerging. And if these are clear in the mind of an operator, then it is very easier to understand and to, let's say, categorize a potential activity, a potential case as a red flag. And so this, I hope, was useful to make a bit to have, let's say, a more clear and concrete idea of what from research, from, let's say, more theoretical research, we get to the real world. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giorgia. And I love how you end up with this case study that really brings to life how the indicators can be used in practice, and that it's not just about what to look for, but also when to look for these kind of red flags emerging. So yeah, let's go now to border corruption. And I without any more ado, Jacopo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Let me just open the presentation. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so in this third part of the workshop, we are going to focus our attention on the risk indicators, basically for corruption at border spaces. So we have seen 2 examples now with Daniel and Giorgia, where basically we started our research activities with a robust and solid literature on developing red flag and risk indicators, while when we started to focus our attention and target corruption at border spaces, we have seen immediately how scarce was the literature on the topic. We had a group of very interesting work by Chalendar and colleagues who attempted basically to identify methods and indicators for detecting border corruption risk. Then we had examples and works on risk assessment to detect the predicate crimes of border corruption, such as, for example, drug trafficking or custom fraud. But beyond these 2 groups of works, the literature was much weaker than the example that we have been before. So we started basically our work under the FALCON project with a bird's eye view on border corruption typologies and potential indicators. So we arrived at the first set of indicators with the aim of increasing basically our knowledge of what can be done now and in the future, given the current level of technological advancement and data availability. Then we went through a process of validation of this first set of indicators to enter into a sort of warm eye view on a list of specific indicators relevant specifically for the FALCON project. And in this case, the aim was, in fact, supporting the FALCON efforts to identify red flags and risk indicators for the use case 3. As I told you, we started basically our effort with a review of the existing literature. Of course, we were looking at, definition for border corruption. We used David Young's definition of border corruption as an illegal exchange of resources between border officials, who are the bribe takers, and private actors, who are the bribe givers, basically. We have 3 types of private actors: individuals, formal organization, informal organization, and two types of public-private relation, collusion and coercion. So this gave basically birth to a scheme made by 6 typologies of corruption on the side of, in fact, the types of private actors and public-private relations. Then on the top of that, we can identify basically different types of public actors who are relevant for the management of border spaces, such as, for example, border guards, police officers, custom authorities, veterinary and phytosanitary officers, and other authorities and entities that goes to complete the picture of the public actors who cover relevant roles at border spaces. So secondly, we moved to think how and why people basically engage in corruption at border spaces. For example, we can see for public actors like police officer, border guards, or customs who want basically to extract resources by the private actors who try to cross the border, rent-seeking mechanism. This is a first category of crime or offenses that come together with what we mean like corrupt exchanges at border space. Then we have, of course, trafficking and smuggling offenses. We know about drug trafficking and other types. And then finally, financial fraud and crimes like tax evasion and the circumvention mechanism. This literature review on the topic permitted us also to identify cost and impacts coming from border corruption. For example, we clearly see health problems because of border corruption, for example, facilitating the trafficking of drugs, so drug consumption, a cost for society, of course, the trading of unsafe products, a security issue with the increase of street-level violence, for example, and for finally, market competition from counterfeit products or reduction in taxes collected. This is some of the insight emerging from a first level literature review. Then we moved a little bit, trying to go a little bit more in depth into the topic of border corruption. And after doing some scoping interviews, we decided to focus our empirical attention on 2 critical spaces. One, sea border, basically Rotterdam Harbor in the Netherlands. As we know, it's a very critical border space in Europe. And secondly, we analyzed also Capitan Andreevo border checkpost. Is a space dividing Bulgaria from Turkey, another very relevant land border. And with these research activities going into the field, combining desk research and interviews, we tried basically to complete the picture emerging from the literature review, adding in-depth insights on corruption typologies at border spaces. For example, together with collusion and coercion, we saw how relevant are other mechanisms, as infiltration, for example, by organized crime in key border spaces like in Rotterdam Harbor. This is a quite interesting mechanism that we have seen emerging. So then we try to clarify a little bit better, like the corruption risk and the suspicious behaviors that characterize or that are relevant for corruption at sea and land borders. And finally, what we have tried to do is, also to target, to understand a little bit better how relevant is the evolution of corruption over time for what concerns the evolution also of risk of corruption in terms of entities, routes, procedures for managing, for example, customs task and so far and so on. So this was basically the combination between a literature review with more in-depth empirical analysis, focusing on case studies. And this helped us basically to identify key domains or key areas where red flag efforts for creating red flags or identifying risk indicators were significant for the early detection of corruption risk at border. So, for example, the first one, the first area that is very relevant is about exploring the anomalous frequency of association between public actors on one side and private actors, because this can hide basically collusive, corrupt agreements, illicit exchange between public and private actors. So we have abnormally high frequency of association. This can mean that there is, of course, a collusion and corrupt agreement between the two. A second area that looks like promising and interesting as emerging from the literature is the waiting time at border posts. So we know that the imposition of red tape, for example, from public actors on private actors can be an effort to facilitate the payment of coercive form of corruption, rent-seeking mechanism. So this is potentially a second area relevant for red flagging and risk indicators. A third one is more on smuggling mechanism and the related risk of border corruption. So going to try to flag, for example, anomalous frequency of border crossing activity, the length of staying, or the fact that a vehicle belongs to a list of suspicious or stolen car model, or route discrepancies for commercial cargo vehicles or vessels. So a difference between what is declared when doing, for example, importation declaration or the information declared to national single window, and what like the route that is actually followed by a vehicle or a vessel. A fourth method, basically a fourth area that is relevant, is of course an effort for tracking illicit enrichment and unexplained wealth by a public official. We know that after the payment of a bribe, these resources should be somehow laundered or used to improve the lifestyle of this custom official or border guards. And of course, an indicator signaling differences and discrepancies between licit income, for example, the salary, and the lifestyle of a public official is very relevant. And a fifth area that is quite significant for what concerns corruption risk as emerging from the literature is the role of social networks that connect public official on one side and private actor on the other. Of course, there are different dimensions: family connections, place of residency, business interest, criminal relations, and an effort on trying to signal this kind of connection through indicators and red flags can be, of course, significant and important for the operationalization of the red flag system that we want to design under the FALCON project. So here we have very few examples of this first and broad set of risk indicators and red flags. We see here basically the operationalization in a dichotomic here, in this case 0-1, of some of the concepts that I just presented you in the previous slide. So we can see, for example, the frequency of association, waiting time, border crossing modalities, entry-exit frequency, anomalous lifestyle. So these are all tentative indicator connected to their basically operationalization procedure aimed at detecting here suspicious behavior or anomalous behaviors or sort of relation between public and private actors that are suspicious and can hide on one side the risk of corruption, but also risk of predicated offense. In this case, in particular, here we are speaking about smuggling and trafficking activities with border crossing modalities, for example, vehicles and drivers that try to cross a border in group within a very short time frame, for example. So in the meantime, while we were identifying these tentative methods and areas that are relevant for our effort to identify risk indicators and red flags, we have also identified many data sources that are already existing, but of course this does not mean that collecting or gathering information and data from all these sources is easy or is currently possible. So many of these are, of course, limited access, restricted consultation, are elaborated by border authorities, customs, or border guards, for example. I've here highlighted in bold those data sets and data sources that have been used, for example, in the FALCON project. So vehicles identification and recognition tools, this has meant the installation, for example, of a video surveillance camera in specific border space, and so far and so on. So we have many potential sources, but our capacity to really collect and gather information and data from them is still a little bit limited. So spaces for innovation here and for evolution are huge. So what we have produced, thanks to this literature review, the preliminary insights from the in-depth analysis in Rotterdam and Capitan Andrevo, and this elaboration, basically, we produced a broad set, an initial broad set of indicator and red flags. And basically, we went through a process of validation and distillation to obtain something that was specifically usable for FALCON, for the FALCON project, of course, and for the use case 3. So to arrive to a specific limited set of indicators that was going through basically a cleaning process, a feasibility check, the control for the data availability, the fine-tuning of these indicators, and then a process of piloting and testing that is still ongoing. And we go through the entire life cycle of the FALCON project. So this validation and distillation process was not based and ground on a quantitative method, as the one Daniel and Giorgia, for example, have disclosed previously, but was more based on quantitative methods, and basically the close interaction with selected FALCON partners. First of all, collecting comments, inputs, and feedback on a report that we prepared with this broad set of indicators. Then we organized a focus group discussion with a short list of FALCON partners to identify weaknesses, gaps, the feasibility of using one specific data set instead of another one. And so we have been able basically to collect a huge amount of inputs and feedback and to consolidate the partners' inputs and feedback into a report, into a shorter list of indicators. That is the one I'm showing you now, that is basically identifying 5 main areas, 5 main indicators. And this has been used as the ground for developing then the technological tool, the technological solutions that are our technological partners in the FALCON consortium designed and implemented. So basically, as you can see, 4 of these indicators are mainly, can serve mainly for detecting smuggling, risk of smuggling, like frequent crossing, entry-exit frequency, collaborative crossing, short visit, and suspicious car model are all indicators that reveal us or aim to reveal us risk of smuggling, risk of trafficking. While the 4th one, the pairing frequencies between public officials and drivers or vehicles, is more on the interaction and anomalous and suspicious interaction between public official on one side and private actor on the other side. So basically this becomes sort of a pivotal indicator, because permit us to recognize all the other indicators, all the other values that are more directed to identify risk of smuggling to the risk of corruption. So when these different indicators, different red flags are put together into pattern of red flags and risk indicators, permit us to achieve two different goals. One is reducing the risk of false positive that is, as you can imagine, and for everyone living close to a border, as we do in Basel, we know that, you know, like the frequent crossing cannot be considered really taken alone, you know, a very solid or robust. I'm also, you know, crossing a border between Basel and France or Germany many times per month because, you know, simply going to the supermarket. So, and basically flagging me as a suspicious for that, you know, is not something that we can really obtain. So creating and identifying patterns, connecting all these different red flags and risk indicators is as much as important as identifying which are, you know, like the suspicious or the risky behaviors. And I guess this is very helpful at the end of the day also to increase the solidity and the robustness of the flagging method. So just to really to give back something that is properly working and helping us to really detect corruption risk in an area, in a space such as border, where of course corruption is critical, but at the same time it's very difficult. Also, you know, for a different, for example, amount of information with respect to public procurement, and et cetera, et cetera. So we should move even more into the sense of integrating all these indicators and red flags into solid patterns. I close here. Thank you very much. Word to Claudia, I guess.
Thank you, Jacopo. Thank you so much. I mean, I also love how in the presentation you have helped us navigate the complexity of looking at how corruption can be detected in a space as complex as a border crossing, and how this case, having just one or few red flag indicators is not enough. It's about having red flag systems that can signal when several indicators are giving a positive, then maybe this is a case that needs to be looked at in more detail. And I also like how your presentation underscores the fact that it is really important to have an iterative process whereby collaboration with the end users, with the law enforcement agencies is critical in order to make sure that the red flag systems are aligned with what is real and what is feasible for those making the decisions on the ground. So with that, we open for Q&A, and there are already some questions that have been asked. Daniel, you have two questions addressed at you. Maybe you can take them both in one go. The first one is for Yumponias. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It congratulates you for your presentation and is asking about the CRI, calculated as a simple average of the available indicators such as single bidding, tax havens, etc. Or do you use a weighted average provided more weight on a single bidding? That's the first question. And the second one is on following the European Courts of Auditors' last report over the 2011-2021 period, the single bidding rate across the EU single market increased significantly from a fourth to over 40%. I agree that single bidding is the best proxy for corruption, but it's unfortunately not very discriminating. Does that limit the scope of your results or, on the contrary, strengthen them? So Daniel, go ahead.
Yes, okay, thank you for reading them aloud, and thank you for the questions. I think they're both excellent questions. And the first is about do we weigh our indicators to the CRI or not? And this is an excellent question because this is something that we discuss from time to time internally as well. And the short answer is that we do not weigh the indicators for the purposes of the FALCON project. The main assumption here is that by introducing a lot of different indicators, 10 in the case of the project, means that we can connect these corrupt techniques through administrative traces to that many different types of indicators. And having a lot of these indicators together means that we are adhering to a wide variety of these corruption techniques. And if we were to weight some of these above the else, then we would inherently weight some of these corrupt techniques as more important as opposed to some of the other techniques. And that's not in the general spirit of the CRI, because weighting these in the same weight helps us achieving the goal of, if all of the indicators or most indicate high risk, then it will be high risk, because there are a lot of corruption techniques that we are adhering to at the same time. And the final sentence here is that if you have a specific use case which requires you to focus your attention to specific corruption techniques, then it's a very great idea. And CRI is capable of this flexibility, that you can weight some of these indicators above the others. For example, if you are looking at more subtle ways of corruption, so not using tax havens, which is very straightforward. You're using a tax haven country because you don't want to adhere to the country's tax regulations, then you should focus more on more subtle ways, for example, using negotiated procedure against open procedure. We discussed this. Also, the other example, chopping up a large procedure to smaller procedures, and you can catch these with higher weights to the procedure tactics, for example, or stuff like this. And the second question, if I remember correctly, was about the share of single bidding rising from 25% to 40%. So here, I also have a kind of a short and kind of a longer answer. The first answer is, and this is where I tap into my causal database background, is there are more than one possible causes or predictors of single bidding. Some of these are corruption related. For example, we discussed the corruption definition as tailoring the tender so that a single favored bidder wins, right? So these tailoring, restricting competition, avoiding competition, all may cause higher single bidding shares. But there are also predictors or causes that are unrelated to corruption. For example, there are states that are known to be more adherent to single bidding. For example, large construction projects are usually bidded by only a few bidders, or space race projects, or something related to some markets where there are only a few bidders who are valid to bid at all. And here, if this increase is due to more of these non-corruption related causes, then it's making our assumptions a little less robust. But if they are caused by the corruption or by both, then it can help us to strengthen our results. And the final cause here is that the closer we have single bidding rates to 50% as opposed to non-single bidding rates, the less is the between variation between these two groups, which means that the larger the in variation, and we can see a broader scope of potentially corrupt contracts and potentially not corrupt contracts. And the only assumption that we rely on is that single bidding should be a great proxy of corruption. And if that stands, then either it's 25%, 40%, or more, our results will be reliable in the broader sense.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, I'm mindful of time. We have 7 minutes left, and there's 2 questions for Giorgia, one for Jacopo. So, Giorgia, have these 2 questions. What risk do U.S. companies face in engaging with state-linked entities in sanctioned countries? And there are some examples are given. And the second one is, what can be done to better monitor trade flows of semiconductors and refined minerals through intermediaries to Russia? So, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia, and thank you for these questions. I had a few times to just look for these for the example that were provided, and if I'm not wrong, it's about companies that are actually included in sanctioned list, or if not, are still, let's say, a topic of high-level discussions. So the issue is that if they are included in sanctioned list, then companies dealing with, also indirectly dealing with such companies can face for sure legal consequences, so actually penalties. But even if they're still not in this sanctioned list, they still can face some important consequences, both in terms of reputational ones and also, for example, economic ones. So maybe consequences in terms of of how the contracts can evolve, and so this kind of considerations. So this is what I would answer to this first question. And instead, for what regard the second one, well, for sure, the use of, the intensification of screenings and control, both in terms of, let's say, the technological advancements. So, for example, employing also machine learning tools and integrating these super important risk indicators that need to be always updated. And for sure, there is very important. It's very important to intensify the cooperations with those with these countries involved. So Turkey, Kazakhstan, that, as I also mentioned in my presentations, are often used and actually involved in order to facilitate the triangulation of this trade of these prohibited goods. So it's very important to harmonize, for example, the export controls. And here, Jacopo for sure could also add something, but yeah, and also in addition to, let's say, countries' national cooperation, it would be also very useful to intensify also private and public cooperation, so that companies that are active and are operative in these sectors can provide very important evidence that can be useful in order to improve the intelligence picture of this sector. I hope this answer your questions.
Thank you, Giorgia. Marta has a question for Jacopo. We have 3 minutes left. I'm not going to try to summarize it. I don't know if you've read it, Jacopo.
No, I've read it. So it's a very good point. Of course, here, like we return to connecting the indicator with the specific behavior that we want to signal through the indicator. So, of course, what you are saying is border crime down, but at the same time illicit crossing, waiting lines. So the indicator, for example, that I have tentatively identified is about waiting time connected with specific behaviors, rent seeking, extractive. So we are speaking of when public officials impose red tape. So here, what is my point? Research activities should disclose, for example, if this kind of behavior, of this kind of mechanism is really relevant in the context we are focusing our attention, and understand if to operationalize it. Of course, like waiting time per se is not enough. So we need to contextualize, to put into a specific framework understanding. So, for example, we should understand if the US-Canada longer waiting time is depending because of an increase in flow, has, your comment seems to go in this direction, or because of the imposition of red flags by public officials. And this can be another story characterizing, for example, other borders, where we know that this kind of rent-seeking and extractive mechanisms are relevant. And this is, the relevance of doing research activities before, trying to understand the corruption risk that is relevant in the specific, because also Daniel disclosed, how we have different procurement procedures, but not all have the same level of risk in all the countries that we have analyzed. So this is the very same here for what we are discussing at border. The indicator that I have presented you, I had something specific in mind, but it can be that this waiting time is depending by another mechanism or behaviors as the one you are explaining, and this means another explanation and another effort to operationalize the indicator. So I hope that it's clear at this point, and I have explained it, just to satisfy your doubt and curiosity.
Thank you, Jacopo, and thank you, everybody. We're coming to the end of the webinar. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you for the great presentations and insights. I have added, again, the link to the FALCON project website in the comments so that everybody can easily go visit. There are resources to explore, and everything that you want to learn about the project is there. The project is now halfway through, so there's still a lot to come. We have AI-powered tools that are being piloted and refined. So keep tuned in, and thank you again for attending, and have a nice afternoon, morning, or evening wherever you are.